with us Professor Syed Farid Alatas of the National University of Singapore, who will be talking about teaching Marx as a response to Eurocentrism. And we also have with us an anthropologist from the Ateneo de Manila University, Professor Emeritus Fernando Zialcita, who will talk about Marx and his insights as it applies to the current situation that we find ourselves in, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. So without further ado, I would first like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker, Professor Syed Farid Alatas, is Professor of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. He also headed the Department of Malay Studies at NUS from 2007 till 2013. He lectured at the University of Malaya in the Department of Southeast Asian Studies prior to joining NUS. In the early 1990s, he was a research associate at the Women and Human Resources Studies Unit in University Sains, Malaysia. Professor Alatas has also authored numerous books and articles, including Ibn Khaldun, Applying Ibn Khaldun, The Recovery of the Lost Tradition in Sociology, a book that he co-authored with a fellow anthropologist, Vinita Sinha, entitled Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, and The State of Feminist Theory in Malaysia, among other things. His areas of interest are the sociology of Islam, social theory, religion and reform, intra and inter-religious dialogue, and the study of Orientalism. For today, he will be talking about teaching Marx in the context of Eurocentrism. So allow me to read the abstract. This talk or this presentation requires an understanding of what Eurocentrism is, the identification of the traits of Eurocentrism in the works of Marx, the elaboration of Marxist theory, free of Eurocentric assumptions and categories, and finally, the application of non-Eurocentric Marxist theory to historical and empirical cases. This presentation does this drawing from the experience that Professor Alatas and his colleague, Professor Sinha, had teaching an undergraduate course, Social Thought and Social Theory at the National University of Singapore. So without further ado, we now welcome Professor Alatas. Professor, the screen or the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nino, and good morning to everyone. I just want to begin by thanking the organizers for the invitation. I'm of course sorry that I'm not able to come to the Philippines. I used to travel quite a bit to the Philippines, partly because of my long-standing interest in Jose Rizal, whom I consider to be a social theorist, and social theory is one of my fields. And in fact, my interest in Rizal was prompted, was very much influenced by, first of all, by my father, the late Professor Syed Alatas, who was a sociologist, but also by the once dean of the Asian Center at UP in Diliman, Professor Ajit Rai, who happened to have been a very close friend of my father. But on many of my trips to Manila, he had encouraged me and facilitated my research into Rizal, introduced me to people, and I was then finally able to write a few pieces on pieces in which I tried to reconstruct Rizal's social theory. And I'll come back to Rizal later because I want to talk about, to say a few words about Rizal in relation to Marx. But to get to the topic of this morning, which has to do with Karl Marx, As Nino said, the context of my discussion is Eurocentrism. Now, I want to begin by saying that when we talk about social theory, when we talk about knowledge that originated in the West in general, not just about social theory, there are at least two great biases that we need to take into account. One bias is Eurocentrism. The other bias is androcentrism, which is the male bias. And these are two great biases which affect our understanding of social theory, which affect indeed the whole process of knowledge production. They affect knowledge production at the stage of or at the level of theory building and concept formation. They affect knowledge production at the level of empirical research, even at the level of the choice of the selection of topics, the drawing up of research agenda, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm, of course, this morning dealing with Eurocentrism. Now, when we talk about Marx, we need to be aware of this context of Eurocentrism, because it is being conscious of Eurocentrism which enables us to distinguish between the problematic and even distorting aspects of Marxist theory on the one hand, from the more universalistic aspects of his theory, which are not only universal but useful and necessary for us to adopt. So let me just say very quickly a few words about Eurocentrism. Now, the way I define Eurocentrism, I define it in terms of three core traits. There are several other traits, but I would say that there are three core traits. One trait is what I call the subject-object dichotomy. Now, what this means is that according to this dichotomy, the Europeans are the knowing subjects, and non-Europeans become objects of study. So, for example, Marx is a knowing subject, and he studies not only Europe, but he talks about the whole globe. On the other hand, thinkers from other parts of the world, particularly from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, are not seen as knowing subjects. They are, along with their peoples, are objects of study, but there's no attempt to see the world through their eyes. So to give you an example, Ibn Khaldun, a 15th century Tunisian thinker, and widely regarded as a founder of sociology, is rarely seen as a subject. In other words, many scholars look at Ibn Khaldun's work as a source of information and data, historical data about history, especially North African history, but rarely do they attempt to reconstruct his theory and apply his theory. So he's rarely seen as a subject, more as an object. Now, the consequence of this trait of Eurocentrism, the subject-object dichotomy, is the marginalization of non-European concepts and theories. Now, this, of course, is very clear, it's very obvious, to the point that it should actually be very embarrassing and offensive. And I think that's part of the problem. We're not embarrassed and we're not offended by this fact, that if you pick up textbooks on social theory, there will hardly be any reference to non-European theorists. So if you pick up a textbook on classical sociological theory, which deals generally with the thinkers of the 19th century and early 20th century, one would get the impression that there was not a single non-European in the 19th century, as well as not a single woman in the 19th century who could think systematically about the nature of society, the nature of modernity, the social dislocations that were taking place during that period as a result of the Industrial Revolution, about the nature of capitalism. There was no woman who was intelligent enough to think systematically about those processes, and there was no one outside of Western Europe who thought systematically about these problems. This is the impression you get from the text. And this is, more than 150 years, I suppose, after the early social theorists started writing. Even today, you look at all these textbooks, you will get that impression, because hardly anyone has seen it fit to consider that there were women and that there were non-Western thinkers, and that we should try to identify them, reconstruct their works, and write about them. So we've hardly begun to explore that. So so this is the second trait of Eurocentrism: the marginalization of non-European concepts, non-European thinkers, and by extension, the marginalization of their concepts and ideas. Just to give you an example, a major concept which has been marginalized, a major concept which was the focus of Rizal in his theory of colonial society, was laziness. Of course, laziness was the term, indolence or laziness was a term used by scholars, by Spanish colonial officers, and by observers of the Philippines, in the context of the Philippines. But it had not become a social scientific term. But for Rizal, it became a social scientific term, because he looked at the phenomenon systematically. He attempted to define laziness, and he attempted to understand laziness in the context of Spanish colonial history. He dealt with the topic systematically. But because Rizal was neglected, was marginalized as a founding, founding thinker of social theory, along with his being marginalized, we also have the marginalization of his ideas and his concepts. Now, with Eurocentrism, not only do you have the subject-object dichotomy, not only do you have marginalization, you also have distortion. So one of the traits of Eurocentric social science is that the reality of non-Western societies and histories are distorted. And we do not have to go into all the examples here, but a typical example, which is also related to our theme, Karl Marx, is the idea that there's no private property in the third world, in the so-called non-Western world, or what Marx referred to as Asiatic societies. This, of course, was a distortion. It was based on ignorance, partly based on the mistaken view that Europe had within it the seeds of capitalist development, and for many people, therefore, progress. This was a specific feature exceptional to Europe, and this was because of the institution of private property, which allowed for the development of an independent bourgeoisie. And on the other hand, Asiatic societies lack these characteristics and therefore lack the prerequisite for the development of capitalism. So this was related to for Marx anyway, this was, and even for other scholars that preceded Marx, this was related to the idea that Asiatic societies were basically stagnant, and the term used for that was, for example, Oriental despotism, which was a feature of what Marx called the Asiatic mode of production. So here you have an example of distortion. Now, my point is that it's necessary to separate out the Eurocentrism from Marxist theory in order to make Marxist theory universal. So in a way, we need to identify the Eurocentrism in Marx to save Marx from himself. Because if that as long as that Eurocentrism is not identified, then we're not able to distinguish between those aspects of Marx that are erroneous, that are distortions, that are biased, that are prejudiced, from those aspects that are universal, that are timeless, and that are necessary for us to adopt. So let me say a few words about Marxist theory, and then talk about the Eurocentric dimensions of Marx. And then I will move on to and conclude with some discussion about the universal aspects of, or rather the universalistic aspects of Marxist theory. Now, as I'm sure many of you would know, if you know, especially if you are a student and you studied sociological theory, despite the association of Marx with communism, most of what Marx wrote about was not about communism. You know, in the thousands of pages that were penned by Marx and Engels, there were very few pages devoted to communism. And this is, of course, very understandable, because there was no communist society during Marx's time. There was little empirical material for Marx to go on to write about communism. Whatever he wrote on communism was speculative. It was about what he imagined the future might look like. So most of what Marx wrote about was capitalism. Marx's theory was a theory of the origins and nature and impact of capitalism or capitalist society. So within that context, within the context of Marx's interest in capitalist society, most of his writings was about analyzing the nature of capitalism. But he did talk about the origins of capitalism to begin with. And this is discussed in terms of what is very familiar to us, this whole idea of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. The idea that feudalism is a mode of production that contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. That feudal society produced a bourgeois class, which eventually became incompatible with the feudal system, with the feudal relations of production, and which then sought to overthrow feudalism and establish parliamentary democracy, establish capitalism. So Marx's idea was that this only happened in Europe, that there was a pre-modern system which was self-destructive, which was internally, contradictory, and it gave birth to the capitalist mode of production. And this was because of the nature of feudalism, that it produced the bourgeoisie in the cities, and that there was this contradiction between the cities and the rural areas, between what Marx and many other Europeans referred to as the conflict between town and countryside, and that eventually led to the destruction of feudalism and the rise of capitalism. Of course, I'm simplifying very much, but I think the point of Marx and Engels was that the pre-modern systems of non-European societies didn't have that type of contradiction, which led to the internal destruction of their pre-modern economic systems. Therefore, capitalism could not autochtonously, indigenously develop in these non-Western societies. And if capitalism could not develop, then socialism could not develop. If these societies could not undergo capitalist industrialization, they would not be able to proceed to the stage of socialist industrialization. This, on the other hand, was the path of Europe, that it was because it, unlike non-Western societies, it had a feudal mode of production, which then gave way to the capitalist mode of production. This prepared the way for socialist industrialization in the future. So this was the significance of Marx talking about the feudal mode of production and the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Now, Marx also talked about, spent a great deal of time talking about the nature of capitalism. He discussed the problem of exploitation. And for Marx, it wasn't a moral category. It was a scientific category, because he defined exploitation in terms of the workers not receiving the full value of what they put into the product, into the commodities that they produce, in the form of the wages that they received from the bourgeoisie. So that difference between the value of what they put into the product and the wage that they received, which was lesser than the value that they put into the product, defines exploitation. So for Marx, exploitation is not a matter of low wages, because wages might be low or they might be high, relatively speaking, but as long as the workers do not receive the full value of what they put into the product, there is a certain rate of exploitation taking place. Now, the blindness of the workers to the nature of exploitation was what Marx referred to as false consciousness. The realization of this exploitation, in other words, the realization of the workings of capitalism, would lead to what Marx expected would lead to class struggle, would lead to opposition of the working class towards capitalism, towards the bourgeoisie. In other words, class struggle, which of course took various forms, such as strikes, demonstrations, and eventually revolution. But the failure to realize that, and Marx saw that failure very much around him, was understood by him in terms of false consciousness, and also in terms of a very important concept, which is perhaps a central aspect of Marxist sociology, and that is alienation. the alienation of the workers from them from themselves, from the process of production, from their human nature, the state that you are in, the psychological state that you're in, from not being able to realize your full potential as a human being, because you are a worker whose work is directed by people above you. You're doing routinized, mundane work. You're doing the kind of work that doesn't allow you to develop your potential, your creative power. So there is an alienation, objectively speaking, for Marx. It's not just a sense, it's not just a feeling, it's not just an experience, but it's an actual objective process in which human beings are alienated, are separated from their potential as human beings. The survival of capitalism, of course, depends on the vast majority of people believing that the system is a good system, or the only system, there are no other options. And this belief, in other words, the survival of capitalism depends on the people having a view of the world that is in line with the interests of capital. And this inculcation of such a worldview is achieved by the role of ideology. So this was another important aspect of Marx's thinking, the role of ideology, and the idea that that there are ideas which do not reflect but distort reality or refract reality, and that this refraction or distortion of reality functions to maintain the interests of the ruling class. This is Marx's idea, which of course resulted in a whole new field in the social sciences called the sociology of knowledge, of course very much pioneered by Karl Mannheim. Then you have the role of the state, which Marx and Engels characterize as functioning to advance the interests of the bourgeoisie. Their statement to the effect that the state is nothing but the executive of the bourgeoisie. Now, within Marx's concern, and I should say Marx and Engels, because much of Marx's theory is actually was actually the with the cooperation and co-authorship with Engels. Now, as I had said earlier, much of Marx's thinking about the origins of capitalism and the workings of capitalism have implications for the non-Western world. The theory, Marx's theory of the rise, the origins of capitalism, is constructed on the idea of the uniqueness and exceptionalism of Europe, and explicitly the inferiority of non-Europe, of the non-Western world. An example of that is this whole idea of Oriental despotism, the idea that the non-Western world has inferior religion, inferior culture, and of course inferior social structures, and inferior political economy, such that capitalism cannot develop. Now, we're not suggesting that that the non-Western world is inferior because it does not have the seeds, did not have the seeds historically of the development of capitalism. We're looking at things through Marx's eyes, right? Now, from Marx's point of view, there was that inferiority. Marx did not simply make an objective assessment that the traits or prerequisites of capitalism did not exist in non-Western societies. For example, in Algeria, which he talked about, or India, which he also talked about. He made also value judgments about these societies, and he engaged in observations that actually distorted these societies. So, for example, India, he misunderstood to a great extent the nature of colonization in India. There was a time when Marx thought that colonization was something progressive, something positive, and he encouraged it because he thought colonization would result in the successful industrialization of India, and therefore the transformation of India from the transformation of India to capitalism. He failed to, at least in his earlier writings, he failed to understand the fact that colonization did not successfully industrialize India. He also made observations about India that were distorting the idea that there was no bourgeoisie, there was no private property in India, and therefore the conclusion that a capitalist class could not emerge indigenously in India without the aid of colonization. These were all distorting ideas. Here we can see the Orientalist aspects of Marx's ideas, of Marx's sociological theory. Now, it's very necessary to understand the Eurocentric aspects of Marx's theory, because those need to be taken out of his sociological theory so that we could see the universalistic aspects of his theory. For example, the idea of the Asiatic mode of production has its Eurocentric aspects, but it also has an aspect of it that is useful. The Eurocentric aspect has to do with the idea that there's no private property, for example, or that for example, the religions of the despots of the Asiatic peoples are inferior religions or even fake religions. It's quite interesting. Marx said that, for example, Islam was a fake religion. Now, Marx did not believe in religion, but he didn't consider Christianity as a fake religion. But he did say that Islam was a fake religion. So there seemed to have been some prejudice against Islam. So you have these Orientalist or Eurocentric ideas in Marx about Asiatic societies, but the Asiatic mode of production concept is nevertheless a useful concept if we take out the Eurocentric elements from it. The idea that you have a centralized mode of production in which the dominant owner of property is the state is an interesting idea and a valid idea. And that is to be contrasted with feudalism, which is a decentralized mode of production. So obviously there are differences between these two types of modes of production. One is centralized, one is decentralized. The implications for the development of, for political economic development are important. And when we talk about feudalism as well, we can see that there are, although Marx talked about feudalism as a specifically European phenomenon, we can see that in many parts of Asia and Africa, in our part of the world, for example, in the Malay world, we also find feudalism. But if we were to use the concept feudal mode of production in an appropriate manner to talk about pre-modern political economy in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and so on. If we were to do that, we should make a distinction between specifically European form of feudalism, which was based on the institution of knighthood, on serfdom, and so on and so forth, from a more universalistic understanding of feudalism. We can speak of Malay feudalism, for example, which is not based on knighthood, not based on serfdom, but it is nonetheless it was nonetheless a decentralized mode of production in which the Sultan was maybe in name ruler of the whole realm, but in practice the system was decentralized because under the Sultan you had various chiefs or datos who were practically like sultans in their own areas, in their own jajahan, as we say in Malay. So we find that in the Malay Peninsula, you had both a decentralized feudal mode of production as well as a centralized mode of production, which was more similar to what Marx referred to as the Asiatic mode of production. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details, but just to say that, to give you an idea of how we can use Marxist concepts and Marxist categories in a way that's beneficial once the Eurocentric elements are removed. And we can say the same thing about Marxist sociological concepts like alienation. Alienation is definitely a very important and useful concept for us to continue to use to understand the nature of late capitalism, the nature of neoliberal society, and so on. So my time is I think my time is up. So I just want to conclude by saying that apart from considering Marx in a non-Eurocentric manner, and therefore rescuing Marx from his Eurocentrism and identifying the universalistic aspects of Marx, we also need to pay attention to non-Western thinkers, especially thinkers that emerge from our own region, and beyond that, create a dialogue between Marx and these other thinkers. Now, of course, my own interest would be to think about Marx and Rizal. It's interesting that Rizal was in London. Well, he was in London after Marx passed away, but Engels was still alive. And apparently, Rizal used to visit a part of London which was just a few doors away from where Engels used to live. It's very difficult for us to believe that Rizal had not heard of Marx, had not heard of Engels, had not heard of the leftist movement or the socialist movement, which was very active in the UK, certainly in London when Rizal was there. But more importantly, apart from speculating about this, what was the how do we compare Marx and Rizal? And I leave you by with this thought that Marx was very much against. Marx was critical of the Enlightenment project. The Enlightenment project, the Enlightenment thinkers believed that science and rationality would liberate human beings. It would create political systems that were liberating. It would create science that would release man from archaic religious ideas, that would release man from the view that that the supernatural forces control man's fate. Science would allow man to control his destiny, to harness nature, and so on and so forth. Now, scholars like Marx and Weber were critical of this idea because they noted that um, modernity had created a new kind of slavery for human beings. Um, so European men may be becoming liberated from despotism or from feudal obligations, but there was a new kind of slavery. Man was enslaved by capitalism. For example, man was no longer free. I'm sorry, I should say humans were no longer free to develop their own potential. There was a new kind of slavery. They were not able to develop their potential. They were, in other words, alienated. Weber said that humans were enslaved by the iron cage of rationality. Now, Rizal was a bit different. For Rizal, it seemed that there was not enough of rationality. There was not enough of modernity in colonial Philippines. So Rizal was a lot more optimistic about the Enlightenment project. He criticized the church for not being on board the Enlightenment project in the context of the Philippines. So I think here is an example of where we can have an interesting dialogue between Marx and Rizal as we develop, as we try to understand Marxist social theory in a non-Eurocentric manner, and as at the same time we try to reconstruct and develop Rizalian social theory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Alatas, for that insightful presentation. We will get back to you in a while for the open forum. We will now proceed to our second resources speaker. Let me introduce him. Professor Emeritus Fernando Zialcita obtained his Bachelor of Arts in Humanities and Masters in Philosophy at the Ateneo de Manila University. He also earned his MA and PhD in Anthropology at the University of Hawaii. For his MA philosophy, he focused on the philosophy of Hegel, which later on enabled him to delve deeper into key thinkers when studying social theory and anthropology, Marx being one of them. Upon his return to Ateneo, he taught social theory for many years and discussed Marx as one of the relevant contributors. His fields of interest have been, number one, developing a sense of community that transcends the kin group. Number two, defining Filipino identity vis-a-vis two worlds, Southeast Asian and Spanish American. And finally, the conservation of cultural heritage in local development. He is a professor emeritus at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in Ateneo de Manila University and heads the Cultural Heritage Studies program, which annually trains students to document and promote local cultural heritage. For his talk, he will be focusing on Marx in a time of a pandemic or of pandemic. The pandemic, according to him, reveals two things. Number one, that the state must be proactive in protecting its citizens from serious threats and must therefore have sufficient resources to draw on. And point number two, that allowing a free flow of information is crucial to ensure that state can listen to unexpected discoveries by citizens about new threats. He poses an important question. How is Marx's vision of socialism relevant to our present crisis? The author distinguishes between his vision of socialism and the Stalinist, which has warped people's view of socialism. Key concepts which he will be delving into are there is a dialectic between the active self and the social structures which, while created by it, yet also influence it. And number two, society is an ever-changing transformational process. So to give us more insight into this, we now welcome Professor Emeritus Fernando Zialcita.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to thank Dr. Leviste and my department for inviting me to share some ideas on Marx. And I also would like to greet Dr. Alatas for his very insightful discussion of Marx in the context of Asia. I'd like to talk about Marx in relation to the pandemic. I think what is has shown is that in a crisis like this, it's important that the state have resources that it can use to help its own people, and that it should be proactive. A very good example of how a state that's very wealthy has not been able to do it is the United States. This is a sign from Times Square, New York. A lot of businesses closed. It's remarkable that the US, as the center of capitalism, world capitalism, nonetheless has serious problems, first of all, in providing healthcare for its citizenry. Secondly, in protecting its citizens from problems like unemployment. Because many Americans now are unemployed. They have to go on food lines. And they don't know what's going to happen to their rentals. It's truly shocking that the wealthiest country in the world is not able to do enough for its citizens. Whereas less endowed countries, let's talk about Western Europe, or let's talk about Korea, or let's talk about South Korea, or let's talk about China, they're able to do much more for their citizens. Nonetheless, I think the pandemic has also revealed the need for a state that truly respects its citizens by listening to them. I have before me the case of the famous Dr. Lee, who on December 30 of this year was concerned that there was a new virus that was going around and that it seemed to have originated in the Wuhan market. So he posted a warning in WeChat to his colleagues about this new virus. And then he discovered his horror that his warning had gone online. It had been publicized a large majority of people, and that he also discovered that within a few hours he was actually called by the hospital to stop spreading rumors, and then he was scolded by the police within a few days for upsetting the social order. I think what this means is that yes, a state should be capable, but it should also listen to citizens. I like to quote the economist that a healthy society should never have just one voice. It should listen to different voices within it. So what is the relevance of Marx to issues raised by the pandemic? So here are my topics. First, I just want to discuss a few basic concepts in Marx. Then this issue of a caring, capable state, which I find in Marx. And then a state that is truly run by the people. And finally, I want to give a conclusion. Some basic concepts in Marx. First of all, what label to use? Are we going to call him communist, socialist, etc.? Also, there is a structure, there's a dialectic between structure and agency in Marx, which sometimes gets overlooked because we focus too much on structure. We forget the importance of subjectivity and striving in Marx. Finally, I want to discuss a basic concept in Marx, which he got from Hegel, which is the idea of dialectical change through dialectics. Before the Russian Revolution of 1917, socialist, communist, social democrat were interchanged. However, after the Russian Revolution, communists applied only to those who believed that the state should be run by only one party. So henceforth, when the word communist was used from 1917 down to the present, we're really talking about a version of Marxism which says there should be only one party. Now, the germ of this idea began in Lenin, who believed that the party should lead the revolution for the revolution to succeed. Unfortunately, after the triumph of the revolution, Stalin advocated that the party should be in control of everything. The party knows everything. And I think this distorted what Marx advocated and led to the repression in Russia, which led to a lot of suffering for many. Okay. in Marx, the self is an agent that aims to make the world meaningful. So you get this sense in the early Marx, and in fact some of his later writings, that the self is not at home in the world. It tries to make sense of the world. However, it creates social structures that can lead to its own alienation. For example, capitalism, it's a creation of the self. So it's important, therefore, for the self to critique its own creations. A crucial term that Marx gets from Hegel is that social change occurs through what Hegel calls Aufhebung, which Marx also uses. I would, in English, unfortunately, sometimes it's translated merely as abolition, which is actually a distortion. So when I talk about the Aufhebung of capitalism by socialism, you get a sense that when socialism appears, it will just abolish capitalism straight off, which I think has led to a lot of problems. It's actually abolition, detention, lifting up. So what does it mean? I like to use this example, which I use in my classes a lot. My own example is that you can understand this process of lifting up by looking at the way a child's love for his parents is transformed in an adult's love for his parents. By the way, the word I use when speaking of Aufhebung Tagalog is pag-aangat, kalang-angatin. Okay, so let's consider, for example, that both loves, the love of a child for its parent and the love of an adult for his parents, both are unconditional. But there's a difference. In the case of the child, its love for its parent is unconditional because it's dependent, it's physically weak. Whereas in the case of the adult, its love for its parent is unconditional, yes, but it's already a love between equals because by now the adult has become physically strong and is able to fend for itself. It has its own life. So the transformation of one love to another love is really a process of lifting up. Something of the love of the child for the parent is retained, of course, but the love of the parent, the love of the child for its parent is also transformed. There's an abolition of dependency. So, and I think this is very crucial for understanding what Marx is saying about the lifting up of capitalism into socialism. So, okay, let's talk about his notion of a capable and caring state. As we all know, of course, Marx is critical of capitalism. And in fact, he's also critical of the 1789 French Revolution, which had occurred a few decades earlier. And finally, I want to talk about what his socialism is and is not. It's hard to imagine, but actually when Marx was writing, capitalism was actually just new. Okay, together with industrialism, it was a new phenomenon on the continent. It was producing goods on a large scale, which made them affordable. However, only a few capitalists really benefited. The majority population was very poor. Moreover, earlier in 1789, there was the French Revolution, which made democracy the ideal, freedom of speech, freedom to vote. But it did not provide for freedom from want. So this is what happened because of the Industrial Revolution and the fact that there were no safeguards in European countries about the rights of labor. When we talk about minimum wage, 8-hour working day, paid vacations, medical care, this did not exist in the early 19th century. The capitalist was free to do as he pleased. And child labor was preferred in many factories and in the mines because the children could walk easily between the machines or could easily go down to the mines. So there was no protection for the children. Okay, so the French Revolution was a momentous change. It brought in the idea of universal representation of people in running the state. So liberty, equality, fraternity. But for Marx, these were all empty slogans because they were not connected with um, economic realities. Okay, so you may have the freedom to speak out. You may have the freedom to fraternize with your countrymen, but if you're hungry, what does it mean to you? The state did not do anything to protect its citizenry from hunger. Now, I want to discuss briefly the Communist Manifesto, which I think can just as well be called the Social Democrat Manifesto or the Socialist Manifesto, because as I said, communist at that time did not mean the same thing that it meant after the Russian Revolution. I think we should be careful about thinking that Marx wanted all the means of production owned by the state. There are 10 planks. So let's just take a look at the 5, and then the next slide will be another 5 more. Nowhere in his manifesto does he say that all the means of production should be owned by the state. Now, he talks for a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, but that is already being done in many countries today. Abolition of all right to inheritance, but I mean, that's also done even in non-Marxist countries. Centralization of credit. Well, it may surprise you to know there were no central banks then. Central banks began to appear only during the second half of the 19th century. So this is something quite new. Now, regarding abolition of property in land, it may surprise you to know that Amsterdam, the land in the entire city of Amsterdam is actually owned by the municipality. It's not owned individually. In the United States, many lands in the West, like in Wyoming or Colorado, are actually owned by the federal government. Now, centralization of the means of communication and transport, hands of the state. Well, train service in many countries is owned by the local government or by the national government. Okay, so the other one talks about extension of factories, bringing to cultivation wastelands. Okay, equal liability of all to labor. Okay, the idea is everybody should work. And then combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Marx was against the fact that there was a big dichotomy between agriculture and manufacturing. There was a big distinction between town and country. He felt that a lot of the progressive technological change should also be applicable to the countryside, so that people in the countryside would have better chances of attaining a better livelihood. Now, free education for all children in public schools. Well, this was new. This is very new. The public education systems did not exist before the early part of the 19th century. In fact, in the Philippines, we had our first public education system after the decree in 1863 by the Spanish government, which mandated that every major town or city in the Philippines had to have a free public school run by the state, both for girls and boys. So now, it may surprise you to know that actually Marx was against everything being owned by the state. In 1870, there was a Russian who said that as soon as all the present bourgeois institutions are overthrown, everything becomes common property and everyone must join a worker society. Well, Marx made fun of this actually. This is barracks room communism, he said. Everything will be done communally under the guidance of anonymous director. Isn't this very authoritarian? And we're fighting against authoritarianism. So he was against simply owning everything being owned in common. Why? Because for Marx, as was pointed out by Dr. Alatas, what socialism is not really described in detail. What Marx did in many of his writings was to understand the dynamic of capitalism, because he believed that you can only understand what the next stage should be by understanding capitalism itself, which is a new phenomenon. So, thus, Capital is really about is an analysis of the dynamic in capitalism. So Marx was against imposing a priori socialism. He says it can only be implemented when conditions are ripe. So let's go now to his notion of participation in the state. He talks about dictatorship of the proletariat versus dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. He idealized the Paris Commune of 1871. However, he says constantly that the state is for the self, not the self for the state. Despite basic freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution in liberal democratic societies, he complains that actually what reigns is actually a dictatorship by the bourgeoisie. The capitalist class owns most of the means of production. They influence the media, they influence the schools, they influence even religion. So it's actually a virtual dictatorship. He says the voice of the proletariat is not really heard. So it's important for the majority to make its voice heard. Once that happens, he says, then you'll have dictatorship by the proletariat. He mentions that twice or thrice in his writings, but he never calls for dictatorship by a party. What it simply means is that the voice of the majority should be heard. An event of great significance for Marx is what happened in Paris in March and May in 1871. The French army had been defeated by the Prussians. Now, the workers were afraid that the monarchy would return and would remove rights and privileges that the workers had been fighting for. So what they did was they seized power and formed committees to rule themselves and Paris directly. No more representatives. They would govern themselves directly during those 3 months. Okay, and the governance would be by consensus. So this is a barricade in Paris, where actually diverse sections of the population joined: writers, artists, factory workers, etc. Now, constantly he emphasizes that the state is for the self, not the self for the state, because if the self is only for the state, then alienation also results. So it's important for the self always to take a critical position against its own creations. So what will happen, therefore, when the majority truly rule? What will happen to the state? His friend Engels uses the word withering away, Absterben in German, which simply means that the state will wither away. But for Marx, it's more dialectical. For Marx, what will happen is that the state will be lifted up. If you translate to Tagalog, maangat ang Estado. It will cease to be an entity that is alien and alienating to the majority of its citizens. We cannot describe in detail what will happen because it hasn't quite happened, except in the case in the Paris Commune. So it predicts that a huge transformation will take place once the majority are really in charge of the state. So therefore, he is against any bureaucracy that dictates to the citizens and is remote from the concerns of the majority. Research within the past 20 years on Marx's life showed that he was actually a member of key committees in political associations, and that as such, he was open to compromise and change. He never stuck to a position forever. If he saw that there was reason to change, he would change. So what is my conclusion? So my conclusion is that Marx's concept of socialism envisions a state that is caring and capable because it has resources it can use. So he was critical of the state that emerged from the French Revolution, which recognized political freedoms, but did not have the resources to care for the majority of its citizenry. However, he also believed that the people should participate in the state and that their voices be heard, because otherwise, um, an all caring state can also be alienating. So I'm posting here some readings you might like to read. All of these are available online now. My interpretations are actually based on recent writings since the 1960s. They follow a particular line, as you can see. There's Shlomo Avineri, Richard Hunt, Peter Hoodis. Peter Hood is very interesting because he looked at the notebooks of Marx and was able to discover a lot of things just reading the notebooks, as well as, of course, the major writings. Richard Hunt goes into the life of Marx, how he actually behaved in associations. Then Allman Bertel is is a political scientist from New York University who does a very good exegesis of Marx's vision of communism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Emeritus Zialcita. That was a comprehensive and insightful presentation. We welcome back Professor Alatas, and we now open the floor, so to speak, for comments, for questions. I believe Professor Alatas has addressed most of the questions in the chat box. But are there specific points, perhaps, that you would like to share with the bigger audience as far as some of the points that were raised are concerned? For example, I think there was a question on a major criticism regarding Marxist theories that it actually exemplifies economic determinism. Would any one of you or would both of you want to react to that?
Actually, Marx was aware of that criticism. However, in a letter to Ernst Bloch, he said that he had to emphasize the economic side because it was not emphasized enough. But he was careful to point out that there are actually other factors involved too. He pointed out, why is it we're able to appreciate what the Greeks did? And he was very much impressed with the achievements of Greek civilization. The Greeks were a slave-owning society, and yet we're able to appreciate their achievements. So economic determinism is limiting. Also, in his later life, he pointed out that he never gave up on Hegel because he also believed in the importance of the subject on agency.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zialcita. Professor Alatas.
Yeah, I can just just add that I think the economic determinism is something that was developed later on by some of the followers. So of course you have so many streams, so many perspectives, even schools of thought within Marxism, and there's something called Vulgar Marxism, which is very economically deterministic. But as Professor Zialcita said, Marx and Engels were aware of, we could say, the misuse of the ideas. They talked in terms of stressing the economic dimension, but they did not talk in terms of economic determinism. But the determinism was something that was developed by some of their followers. For example, Plekhanov, the Russian Marxist, was very economically deterministic. So we need to make a distinction between Marx and the Marxists.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Another interesting question, which actually falls along the lines of what you articulated a while ago with Professor Zialcita, is this idea of the young Marx and the old Marx. What are your opinions on this? Because there's a question that asks, given our contemporary contexts, our contemporary predicaments, which Marx should we be articulating? Is it the young Marx, who is a humanist, or is it the old Marx, who is a structuralist, or who was a structuralist?
Actually, Peter Hoodies, who delved into both the writings of Marx and into his notebooks even in old age, discovered that Marx stated that explicitly, people say that I've given up on Hegel. Actually, I consider myself a disciple of Hegel even in my old age. So, and Hegel, stresses always the subjective dimension. So there is it's a false dichotomy between the young Marx and which is subjectivist, which
Yeah,
is agency, and the older Marx, which stresses structure. It's a false dichotomy.
yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I do say it's a false dichotomy. We the, the the distinction between the young Marx, the so-called young Marx, and the old Marx has to do, for me, it's more with emphasis. It's not, it's not a change. There wasn't a change from the young Marx to the old Marx. So, for example, the younger Marx was concerned with more philosophical and humanistic and even sociological themes, and the older Marx more with structural and economic themes. But there's still a unity to his thought. So the young Marx talked about alienation. Now, he did not give up an interest in alienation, but the interest in alienation was articulated more in solid political economic terms, in theoretical terms, along the lines of political economy. But the theme of alienation was always there. So I think when we in the non-Western world are thinking of appropriating Marx, let's be critical about the construction. Let's not simply accept or rather unquestioningly consume received accounts of Marx. For example, we don't have to simply accept this distinction between the old Marx and the young Marx.
Okay, thank you for that, professors. There's a really interesting question that I think is worth elaborating on. This question has something to do with the relationship between Marx and Engels. They seem to be portrayed as agreeing all the time. But in your studies of Marx, have there been instances, or were there instances where they had differences in terms of understanding contemporary societies or modern societies, as well as communism?
I think I haven't really looked carefully into Engels, but from what I can see, Marx is more dialectical. I gave the example of how Engels talks about the relationship between the working class and the state. He talks about Absterben, just the state will just wither away once the majority take over. But for Marx, it was true to his Hegelian inheritance. He sees a dialectical transformation. Something of the state is transformed, but something will also be changed.
Yeah, I think to some extent it could be said that Engels' simplification or systematization of Marxist thinking may have led to to a more deterministic understanding of Marxist theory. For example, Engels was often criticized for presenting the whole idea of dialectics in a very simplistic manner, and as if to say that the world functions in such a simple manner. And this could have been taken up, or rather was taken up by some Marxists, especially the Russian Marxists, to give a more simplistic and deterministic understanding of Marx.
Thank you. There are a series of questions. There is a series of questions here that has something to do with how to teach Marx. And I'm giving you a free hand on who would like to answer this question. The first question has something to do with how can educators present Marxism to any audience given designs to repress? No? So in the Philippines, in the Philippine context, you're talking about the anti-terror law, as well as anti-left sympathies. But this can be seen universally as well, as far as expressions of repression or attempts to oppress are concerned. So how can educators articulate Marxism to any audience effectively, taking all of these occurrences into account?
Fernando, would you like to go first, or shall I?
Okay, go first.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer, because the answer really depends on the specific context in which you live. If you live in a highly repressive system, it may not even be possible to talk about Marx directly, right? You may not even be allowed to have Marx on your reading list. You may not be allowed to have Marx. You may not be allowed to have Marx in your syllabus. So it becomes impossible. You would only be able to talk about Marx, to your students, without putting it on the syllabus officially. In other contexts, for example, in my country, in Malaysia, there were times where it was difficult to talk about Marx in public. I remember there was a case. There was supposed to be, I think it was a public seminar about Marx, and it had to be cancelled because the authorities did not give permission. Something like that happened. This was a couple of years ago. But at the same time, Marx is taught in the universities, because it's more or less recognized that the universities are allowed to treat Marx in an academic manner. So you really have to understand the context in which you are operating. Now, having said that, there are ways to teach which enable you to subvert, as it were, the authorities. Let me give you an example. If you're in a situation where you can't teach the text of Marx, but you want to teach about Marx's theory of alienation, right? One way to subvert the authorities is not to assign Marx's text, but assign another text which thematizes alienation. What I do, in the case of Singapore, I'm teaching in Singapore, we can teach Marx. So I assign the pages from Marx's Paris manuscripts where he talks about alienation, but I also assign the short story by Franz Kafka, The Metamorphosis, which also thematizes, to me, alienation. If you are in a situation where you're not allowed to assign the works of Marx, you can just ask the students to read Kafka's Metamorphosis, which is a short story, and then you discuss the theme of alienation within that context. And you may even make, in your class, you may make references to Marx. Marx provides the theory to understand Kafka's Metamorphosis. So these are, just an example of a strategy that you can use to get around the restrictions in your particular country or community.
Thank you for that, Professor Alatas.
Thank you,
Professor Zialcita, would you like to add something?
Yes, I really think the context has to be examined, because if the context is really too repressive, we cannot discuss Marx. But I think there can be leeway even during the martial law period under Marcos. It was possible to discuss Marx. I was talking then with an army officer who had some exposure to the humanities, social sciences, but Marx was not a communist. He knew the distinction. So I think it's important to distinguish between Marx and the ideas of Stalinist societies, which promote a one-party state. You can start with a distinction.
Yeah.
Or you can also use what Dr. Alatas said. I mean, use short stories or other sources to talk about, for example, alienation or exploitation.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zialcita. There is a question here, and I think we have room for two more questions before we conclude, no? Before we ask our speakers for their closing statements, no? There's a question here regarding Marx and Hegel. And let me read. While acknowledging that Marx didn't give up on Hegel as part of Marx's insistence on the role of the subject, would there not be value for Asian post-Marxists in employing other theories of subjectivity that would take into account, say, the internally hybrid and multicultural character of being Asian? Anyone can answer.
All right. Yeah, I mean, that's the... yeah, that's a very big question. Yeah, the answer is yes, okay? Of course. We happen to be talking about Marx in this session, but I don't think anybody is suggesting that we should all be Marxist or that Marx is the most important thinker in, for us. I would actually say the reverse, that Marx is an important thinker, and Marx's thought should be incorporated into our thinking, but there is a host of Asian thinkers, not to mention African and Latin American thinkers, and even in the European context. For example, Russian thinkers, we never take an interest in Russian thinkers. Even if we're talking about classical theory from the 19th century, there are so many Russian thinkers who are so important, and maybe what they were reflecting on in the nature of their pre-modern systems, on the problems of modernization, might have been more relevant to us than some of the Western European works. So, the Russian socialists, the Russian nihilist thinkers from the 19th century, and of course the Russian Marxists, there's almost zero interest in them in Southeast Asia. We hardly read the works of Indian thinkers from the early part of the 20th century, the early Indian anthropologists and sociologists, even within our region. And I really think we need to take this seriously, and we need to develop a sense of shame. I mean, how is it that one of the greatest social thinkers from the region, Jose Rizal, the first critique of colonialism from the region, is almost entirely ignored in the rest of the region, in Indonesia and in Malaysia and in Singapore. In Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, you will only talk about Rizal if you're in a Philippine studies program, if you're doing research on the Philippines. But if you're studying anthropological theory, if you're studying social theory, you're studying sociology or anthropology, or you're doing Malay studies, there's no reference to Rizal. It's as if Rizal is completely irrelevant. This is offensive and shameful, that we do not take an interest in our own. The same goes for Pramudia Anantatur, who I would say is a latter-day Rizal. There's absolutely no interest in him unless you're interested in Indonesian literature. But as a person who reinterpreted colonial history, using literary tools, we don't consider him of universal significance. So I really think we need to reorient the way we think about knowledge production.
Yeah. For my case, I find it difficult to discuss Marx without Hegel, because Marx uses the categories of Hegel. Because what makes Hegel so remarkable was that as a thinker, he problematized and tried to make sense of social change. At least in the West, was the first one to discuss this. Now, I don't know enough about traditions elsewhere to figure out if there are other thinkers also who spoke about social change around that period. Okay, just to reiterate, Marx derives his categories from Hegel, so it's for me difficult to discuss Marx without Hegel.
Thank you. For our final question for this afternoon, we apologize because we won't be able to address all your questions, which are excellent, by the way. Rest assured that we will try to compile them all, and if our speakers have time, we can actually have them go over these questions, and we will try to get back to you as promptly as we can, as far as your concerns are concerned. No? For the final question, because both of you may be Global South scholars in your own right, but you're also teachers first and foremost. So the question actually appeals to teachers first and foremost. What would be the best book as far as introducing the philosophy of Marx to an audience is concerned? Which of these books would you recommend, particularly in the context of contemporary Asian societies? And we will end with that.
Maybe I'll answer that question first. I don't really know the answer to that, because I don't feel that there is any one best book to understand Marx. The way I teach, I generally don't assign books which talk about Marx. I assign the readings of Marx and Engels themselves. I feel that is the best way to teach Marx. That one should begin with the original writings of Marx and Engels, and work through the ideas, and with the guide of your professor, try to reconstruct their ideas. I think this is a better learning process. But in that connection, I want to say something, if I may, Nino, very quickly, because there was a comment by somebody who said on the chat, who said that there were women thinkers in the 19th century, and he or she mentioned Harriet Martineau and one or two others. I have to respond to that, because when I said that there were no women thinkers, I was being sarcastic. I was saying that if you look at the textbooks, it looks as if there were no women thinkers or no non-Western thinkers, when actually there were. And since we're talking about books, my colleague Vanita Sinha and I published a book called Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, in which we do include women thinkers, including Western. We talk, Harriet Martineau is included, and non-Western women thinkers, as well as non-Western male thinkers, as well as Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. So definitely women thinkers did exist, but they are ignored in writings on the history of social thought and in social theory texts. They are ignored, and this is the androcentrism of the field.
Thank you for that, Professor Alatas. May I now invite both of you to successively give your closing statements before we conclude this conversation for today.
Well, I'd like to end with that quote I showed in the last slide, which is, democracy is by the people, socialism is for the people. So I think we need a state that is for the people and by the people.
Thank you, Professor Zialcita. Professor Alatas, your closing statement.
Maybe I will talk more about knowledge production. I just like to reiterate that for all the interest that we take in Western theorists such as Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and many others, and we definitely should take an interest in them, let us also try to form a dialogue between them and thinkers in other traditions, as well as especially thinkers that come from our own region. And in that context, we need to talk more among ourselves. How do we compare Rizal and not only Rizal and Marx, but also Rizal and Pramudia Anantatur? Let's get these dialogues going, and let us proceed to teach in this manner, revamp our syllabi, and rewrite our textbooks.
Thank you very much, Professor Alatas. So on that note, we would like to thank our speakers for gracing us with their presence this morning. It has been a privilege and an honor to have you and to share your insights despite your busy schedules. And we would like to take this opportunity as well to thank our participants. We have online communities which we rely on for these webinars to be a success. And it is a pleasure to have you again in this special webinar that we had this morning. We particularly would like to thank the organizers behind this, Dr. Melissa Navarra, my colleague from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Carl Reyes, who is our graduate assistant, who is responsible for the logistical aspect of this webinar. And on that note, we would like to invite you all again to a series of webinars that will be announced. So stay tuned, and we expect your dynamic and usual participation in this webinar. So thank you very much, and have a pleasant day to each and everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.